One of the key things that we want to make sure that we understand is when you post a level for return on equity, what can it be attributed to? And one of the things we've learned here is that the DuPont expansion, which comes back from when DuPont took over a large stake, a 24% stake in General Motors back in 1919, what they discovered is there was a way to be able to break this down through two different types of expansions. And this is what this one wants to play with. The first of those expansions says if you were to take your return on equity, we could break that down into a relationship between return on assets and what is known as an equity multiplier. The second expansion that they had is they said, well, we can break it down further and say that the return on equity is equal to the profit margin times the equity multiplier. Okay, so those you've got a profitability measure, you've got the equity multiplier being a risk measure, and we're looking at a turnover ratio, total asset turnover here as an efficiency measure. So this problem is just taking advantage of that. Double Y Dealers has a return on assets of 10%. Profit margin is 2%, and its return on equity is 15%. And what it wants to know is what is the total asset turnover and what is the equity multiplier. So in the first case, what we want to do here is to recognize that the ROE is equal to, so 15% is equal to the return on assets of 10% times the equity multiplier. So we can simply look at a ratio of those two things in order to come up with the equity multiplier. So if we were to deal with this latter expression right here, namely that the return on equity divided by the return on assets gives us assets divided by equity, or an equity multiplier of 1.5 times. The second expansion that we had talked about return on equity of 15% is equal to the profit margin times the equity multiplier times the total asset turnover. So to find that total asset turnover, we can go through this in a variety of fashions. One we've seen broken up right here is to simply take the return on assets of 10% that we have there and divide it by this profit margin of 2%, and that gives us a value of 5. So manipulating these, it begins to tell you a little bit here. Here's our risk measure. Here is our efficiency measure. And both of those are components that help explain what this 15% return on equity, how much from efficiency and how much from risk.